Dr. Mohammed Al Sudairi, time flies. We had you exactly 3 years ago on BRI Dialogues. And oh boy, the world has changed. And who better to have back on BRI Dialogues after this so pompous, so magnified trip of President Trump to the three GCC states? My key question for you, sitting in Australia, of all places today, joining us, and we're grateful for that, is that what is China's interpretation of Trump's visit to these three GCC states? And what are your optics for this great power competition concerns? And what is the motivation of these three GCC states in this magnificent purple, red carpet, and all other carpets that were rolled out?
By the way, before you answer, Mohammed, for the record, that was three questions. I always get the blame for asking multiple questions. So don't feel obliged to answer all of them at once.
He's
Welcome
being
back,
naughty.
Mohammed.
He's being naughty.
They're all very heavily entangled with each other. So, um, I'm very happy to be back. And indeed, 3 years is quite a long time. And in many ways, we're in a very different world and in uncharted territories. And certainly, kind of the frames of analysis and how we approach certain things, including China's presence in the region, has been subject to a rethink, right? Given how much has changed in the course of this period. So I'll begin by first maybe talking a bit about what I've seen in terms of Chinese analysis of Trump's visit. Certainly, I've only seen some pieces from people whom I consider to be very good Middle East watchers in China. And it's interesting that across the board, right, whether it's people like who are old hands such as Ma Xiaolin or people like Niu Xinchun or even like younger scholars, it's interesting to see that the trip has confirmed kind of this ingrained assumption or perception of the Gulf as being an area that is resolutely aligned with the United States, right? In a way, the pageantry around him, his tour in Riyadh, Doha, Abu Dhabi, confirmed a lot of their assumptions. There's also kind of this other cluster of analysis, which is also very interesting, that has paid a lot of attention to the technological dimensions of the trip, particularly pertaining kind of the chip sales and the permissions given by the US government, NVIDIA, and kind of its provision of these categories of very important products to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And I think that is part of this growing interest in Chinese scholarship on kind of technological competition between the two great powers in the Middle East. So that's kind of what I've noticed in terms of kind of the debate or kind of how people are observing the developments there. Now, in terms of how we could maybe understand what's happening there in relation to US-China competition, as you guys probably know, and I've talked your ears off about it, I'm not necessarily someone who subscribes to kind of the idea that there is a tangible China-US competition taking place in the wider region. I think this is kind of an analytical frame that it certainly exists in the minds of the folks in the Beltway, regardless of their ideological tendency or positioning, but I don't necessarily think it actually reflects what's happening on the ground. I think most elites in the region, with some exceptions, are very much, I would say, committed and comfortable to kind of US, I wouldn't call it hegemony, but the US dominance in the region, right? Certainly, they don't fully trust it. They want to build some degree of strategic autonomy. And this is why, for example, other actors such as China, Russia, and India are very useful. But they don't necessarily seek kind of a complete overthrow of this dominance, right? And I think what the Gulf has been really doing is very much aligned to that. Gulf elites, for the most part, see the United States as a guarantor, as a source of technological innovation, very much tied to a lot of their kind of, I would say, deep regime interests. And they don't necessarily see China as an actor that could viably provide these. I think what has happened over the past 10 years, and this trip kind of represents a culmination, and perhaps one could argue even a success of their strategy, is that there has been kind of this degree of growing mistrust between US and Gulf elites, right? I mean, this has been fueled by a sense that different US administrations haven't really been committed to Gulf security completely. The Obama administration, even the first Trump administration, since under its watch, the Abqaiq attacks happened then in 2019, and with, of course, also the Biden administration. So there's been this mistrust, and I think they have tried to use many different means to arrest the US drift away from the region and to kind of work around this mistrust, including using a China card, right? So they've oftentimes, the different leaders through speeches, through signals from different officials, have often told US officials, if you don't necessarily provide us with what we want from you, we have other options. And oftentimes it's really China in the background. And I think you could argue that they have been very successful. I mean, the very fact that they've been able to obtain the kind of the chips from the United States on this trip is indicative of how successful and how far they've gone in comparison to the state of affairs maybe 8 years ago, right? When US officials were unwilling, but also wanted to place restrictions on Gulf China relations, right? Without necessarily offering any alternatives. So it's very interesting to think of it in those terms, right? Which is the US is still very much the supreme actor, and China in many ways offers some room for these actors to maneuver, but also to extract certain dividends and benefits from the US hegemon, or I mean, not hegemon, but the dominant power, as it were. So this is kind of my take, as a general one of what's happened.
It's a fantastic kickoff, Mohammed. So thank you very much for that. Just one observation regarding sitting in Beijing and watching all this going on. If you kind of broaden a bit, so there are views that for all the effort China put into accommodating Bashar al-Assad's regime and getting advantage in kind of post-war reconstruction, that the smoke blew in the face of them, that for all the effort that they've put into hanging on to Iran as this potential, thorn in the side of the Americans, the Iranians are practically rolling backwards to accommodate Trump's peace. With the GCC, where they've put so much effort through BRI, but through technology, through infrastructure building, through power, and so on, that, one would have said 2 years ago when we were in Rome that, China has stitched up the region. And yet you can see the stitches beginning to come off. That Syria is not what it was as far as potential investment opportunities for China, that actually GCC is now showing very clearly that it does not want to rely on the Chinese for anything beyond, if you like, broad trade investment, let's call it that. And that the one pawn that they wanted to hang on to, Iran, is also about to just literally like sand fall through their fingers. So have they miscalculated? Was it never about security and Chinese are comfortable about the Americans doing all this? But then what happens to the technological tussle between the two sides? As you know, China is very keen on the digital Silk Road and such like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily see things as binaries where, the US advances and benefits, and therefore China loses and retreats. I think the picture is a lot more complicated than that. And it actually relates also to just how the global system is structured. There are certain things that the US has a definitive say on that China cannot necessarily do anything with regards, like, say, the sanctions regime globally. The US is dominant by virtue of the SWIFT system. The dollar is supreme, right? And renminbi cannot, by just virtue of how China's political economy is structured and capital controls. So they have different strengths and different positionalities in the global context that shapes their regional engagement. So Syria, for example, you mentioned it. If you look at Assadist Syria, right, rhetorically, they have depicted their relation with China as almost that of an alliance, right? That these were like-minded states that were dealing with a US-dominated order, that they were subject to very similar technological and economic attacks, that there should be kind of common solidarities between them. They were party states that should have a similar psyche and kind of ideological makeup, all that spiel. But when you look at the actual data, right, and you look at kind of the actual Chinese presence in Syria, and Andrea Giseli and I, we did analysis on that in an article that came out with a special issue that you had overseen, Anush. The trade and investment flows were infinitesimal in comparison to what China was doing elsewhere in the region. I mean, even the way that they've categorized the relationship. Now, let's put aside the Syrian discourse about China. Let's look at what the Chinese themselves, at least in terms of their official rhetoric, conceive of Syria. It only gained kind of a strategic partnership status very, very late in comparison to other actors in the region. But there is kind of this huge disparity between kind of the media discussions, especially in the West, about Syria-China relations and China coming in and acting as a reconstructor and savior of Assadist Syria, and the very modest realities of it. And all of that kind of limitation was really created by the sanctions regime that was US-led. The Caesars Act imposed very serious limitations to the Chinese economic footprint. I certainly think that is also applicable to Iran, right? And what's interesting is that I suspect that now that we have seen, thankfully, the lifting of sanctions from Syria and kind of the renormalization of Syria, this will actually probably create a big boost for Sino-Syrian relations, right? This is the irony, and I think this is also the problem where we are kind of habituated, because of the narrative ecosystem we're in, to think of China as, a rival state that aligns itself with regimes that are hostile to the US, when in fact it's far more enmeshed with states that are very closely aligned with the United States, right? It's much more complicated than the binary that sometimes is set up. I'm actually quite optimistic, for example, when it comes to Sino-Syrian relations. There might be a few files that would need to be resolved, primarily, for example, that of the Uyghur foreign fighters. But even then, I personally don't think that it's going to be that big of a file. There was already kind of recently, I think a week or so ago, a very high-ranking Chinese delegation that met with Ahmed al-Shara. So I think there will be kind of a renormalization and a kind of a high degree of pragmatism between the two sides in terms of resolving this file and whatever others that are lingering. But in that sense, I think that's a very good demonstrative case study of how this kind of approach maybe needs to be revisited and rethought.
I'm always
sorry. I went in a very different direction.
I'm always intrigued by how brilliantly you unpack our questions and bring a different lens and light on issues. And you're absolutely right. And I think removal of the sanctions as a headline is far easier than really removing these spaghettis that have been entrenched for a long time. And the second question, not for us today, is that who has the products at the price point that people in these demolished economies can afford? And that is where China shines. But I want to ask you a question, Mohammed, about I2U2, and this India, Israel, United States, UAE. With this splurge and, show that we witnessed of commitment of these three GCC states, is that going to be I2U2KQ as well, as, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar added to that? Is I2U2 as an initiative and as a rival that was announced to BRI still alive? Is it in coma? Can it be resuscitated? What are your thoughts there?
I'll share my thoughts, but I'd be very curious also to hear your thoughts on it.
Very naughty.
You know, I mean, it's a conversation, isn't it? Dialogue, BRI dialogue. um, well, I mean, I think one, this project, kind of the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that's also tied to the U2I2U kind of project is very much, it reminds me a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative in the sense that it's kind of a story that's being said to kind of mobilize imaginations and potentially policies in specific directions, right? And in the case of that particular project, it's really about kind of putting forward a regional axis made up of the United Arab Emirates on the one hand and Israel in conjunction with great powers that are opposed to China, right? And I think that's the particular vision of that project. I am not so sure looking ahead whether that project is viable, or maybe we could say that it's gone into a coma, as you say, because I think for Gulf elites, and maybe I can't speak, of course, to what happens in the deepest of the deep black boxes, but my assumption is that looking at the region today, the main contradiction regionally is Israel. I mean, there are still, of course, problems related to Iran's role, but it's really Israel now that is playing a very disruptive and destabilizing role across the region, right? I mean, let's take a step back. The region's story for the past 25 years has been essentially one where a vacuum has emerged in what we could maybe describe as the Arab East, right? I mean, this was jump-started by the American invasion of Iraq, but also the sanctions regime in the 1990s paved the way for this. And this kind of opened up a Pandora's box that was then amplified by the uprisings of 2010, 2011, and it led to the collapse of multiple Arab states or central authorities. And that kind of created an opening for a lot of non-Arab actors, aspirants for regional hegemony, to really try to fill that void. I mean, the Islamic Republic, Turkey, and to some lesser extent, Israel. The Gulf has also made, you could add it as a fourth pole, although there have been limitations to how far they could go. But you could argue that the most kind of ascendant actor, because of kind of its forward defense strategies and its success in utilizing proxies, was Iran for the past 15 years. And that you could argue that Iran was the primary contradiction. But because of the, I would say, major debilitating attacks on its proxies, and also kind of the shows that ultimately indicated, at least for regional audiences, that it was something of a paper tiger, right, from 2023 onwards, I think the regional dynamic has changed significantly. And you can also add to it the fact that the Gulf, at least, has entered into a process of détente, right, with Iran prior to that. So I think all of this has fed into a regional situation where the only actor that is now still seeking to escalate and lead to a continued state of war is really Israel, right, under the Netanyahu government. And you can see, of course, that there's also kind of this emerging fundamental clash in Gulf interests with those of Israel in Syria. Right. So all of this is contributing to a situation where it becomes very, very difficult for the Gulf to not only pursue coordinating projects with Israel, but for the remaining major Gulf actors to pursue normalization. This is why whenever I hear talk about normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, especially at the current moment, or people who say that, well, immediately once Gaza subsides, the two sides will enter into it. I just don't see that happening, right? There's no major incentives for the Saudi state to do so. And there's really limited benefits and utility so long as you have an Israeli state that is expansionistic, maximalistic, doesn't really want to abjure its settler colonial policies in the West Bank or its ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Kind of tying that back to this UAE-Israeli axis, I think the Emiratis also see that the optics of being too close or engaged with Israel is something that they don't necessarily want to put in the forefront or the limelight as much as before. I mean, yes, they've been actively defending, for example, their diplomatic ties with Israel. I mean, I don't know if any of you have seen the well-spoken Emirati foreign minister's interview. I think it was with Fox News, where he was essentially justifying normalization with Israel on the basis of, or the continued maintenance of diplomatic ties as one that has allowed for the UAE to provide aid to Gaza. And they were presenting a figure of like, I think 40% or above of all aid that has gone to the Gaza Strip coming from the UAE. And they're kind of saying, well, that was because we were able to mediate and negotiate with the Israelis. Although again, to what extent when the Israelis, I mean, for the past 2 months, for example, suspended all the entry of all aid into the Strip, right? To what extent do you actually have influence? Yeah, I would say that it's been probably put on the shelf is the short answer. But I think, you know, we have to take into account how much the regional dynamics have changed and where Israel now, as opposed to providing advantages, can provide a lot of headaches and problems for the Gulf. And they already, I mean, and just another angle to this, and then we'll maybe move on to a different question, is that in the past, right, the coordination and the closeness or the establishment of ties with Israel was conjoined with other strategic benefits, right? In the case of Saudi Arabia. So for instance, the nuclear program or certain technological goods being provided to it, or even the security treaty. I think the Saudis are making very big advances in these various different categories and have successfully managed to de-link the two, right? So, you know, I just don't think it's something we can expect looking down the line.
So if that's the fate of I2U2, what about BRI itself then, Mohammed? On two levels. First, you know, the pressure of the tariffs on China. China, I think, has been remarkably agile in trying to manage the chaos that the tariffs might have brought. Not just on China, but also, of course, on China's many trading partners who are also de facto, you know, kind of sufferers of this. But given that China might feel it needs to consolidate, does it have to toss up a choice between its own economic prosperity and BRI, or does it see the tariffs as yet another opportunity to push forward and open remaining markets because the tariffs are so damaging for particularly global South countries, but also in Europe, actually? I'm interested to hear your views on.
I'll answer that, but you're sidestepping the fact that I wanted to hear your thoughts on I2U2.
No, I'll go back to that. As you know, I've written on that, so I'll go back to that one with pleasure.
Oh, I like how you've sidestepped this completely and threw it back at me. I'm still kind of waiting for analysis that looks at, I mean, and I'm thinking here specifically of the Gulf, how the Arabian Peninsula is going to be positioning itself in the context of this kind of, I would say, ongoing trade war, right? Because this is not simply something that came out of nowhere. This is just simply a new chapter of an ongoing process that has been there since 2016, right? And I think, you know, like when you look at, for example, the Chinese party state, I think they have made it very clear, if you look at kind of the white papers, the issued studies, and statements of different members of the leadership there, that there is an operative assumption that there's an inevitable economic and technological clash with the United States. And they've built capacity over time to kind of deal with that. I mean, one aspect of that story is that if you look at the composition of the global south, and if we want to still use that term, in terms of China's external trade, it's actually been rising steadily for the past decade. And that's kind of part of this attempt to build up resilience. Now, what's going to happen down the line? I'm not really sure. Only because, if you look at, for instance, in the immediate fallout that came after Trump's declaration of Liberation Day with the tariffs, there was kind of this very loudly touted ASEAN tour that was done by Xi Jinping. And there was a lot of expectations that the Chinese state will put forward new initiatives, maybe rally the different states with regards to the tariff war. But there wasn't actually anything new that came out from that trip, at least nothing that is seemingly new. Would also be interesting to see also what comes out of the ASEAN-China GCC summit, in fact, in terms of outcomes. But it's difficult to say whether China, for example, seeking to deal with the US kind of pressures, will press or invite other states to open up their economies. Because, I mean, what you're seeing, for example, in the context of the Gulf, is they don't want to be dumping grounds of Chinese products, for instance, in different categories. They also seek to protect different sectors and key industries. They're also trying to develop manufacturing capacity with certain products. I don't necessarily see the trade war necessarily moving us in a direction, if that's what you were initially implying, where trade between China and the Gulf, for instance, is going to be liberalized, right? I mean, I think now there's more of a kind of a statist neoliberalism, but also with now increasingly a protectionist twist that has become the norm across the world. And I think that's certainly visible in the Arabian Peninsula. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I mean, the biggest indicator for that is that both sides have not signed an FTA agreement, the GCC and China. And I personally would bet against its signing, or if it's signed, it would be an extremely watered down agreement. But it's also would be interesting, and this is something that would require looking up the data and information, is how much now the Chinese outsourcing of their industrial capacity will affect the Middle East. Because if you look at the past 5 years, there's actually been this growing trend where many different Chinese industries and companies have been relocating abroad to Southeast Asia, India, and to a lesser extent in the Middle East. And that has a lot to do, of course, also with the rise in labor costs in China, but also as part of an attempt to kind of bypass US restrictions, tariffs, and whatnot. So that might be a facilitating factor, but I don't have the data on hand in terms of, say, the Gulf or the Middle East writ large, although I would imagine Egypt would be a big arena for something like that.
I want to go back to your question, not to dodge it. My take on many of these headlines and titles that were Western driven and initiated, such as the Global Gateway, Build Back a Better World, I2U2, is that they're all good with abbreviations, but with execution and deployment of capital, they're all laggards. I mean, Build Back a Better World has, according to some, 50 to 70 billion deployed altogether. Global Gateway, which is 27 European nations, 300 billion. And you look at Belt and Road, BRI, it's 1.5 trillion and counting. And with regards to the nature of many of these, GCC economies as transit hubs, my 2 cents is that they are net beneficiaries of that transfer of capacity and overcapacity of China in goods and products, in reconstruction of, Syria, Libya, and the rest of it, and Iraq. So I think they look at it more in a transactional way, in my humble opinion. And I have a question. I hope I answered your question there. But I have a question for you, and I want to go back 80 years when, Roosevelt gave exactly 80 years ago, 1945, the first airplane to King Abdulaziz, the first, DC-3 aircraft, Douglas. And now Qatar is giving. So it's a change of roles in many ways, when you look at it. So is this charm offensive of all of this capital being committed to United States, at least even half of it, going into a kind of oil for technology, because United States doesn't have the energy capacity at home front at the moment for many of the ambitions vis-a-vis AI. So is United States in a way outsourcing with full hegemonic position and assurance that it can control these states in many ways, from defense umbrella and the rest of it, but bringing the needs for that AI race to an oil economy in which the oil countries would say, oh, look at us, we are getting into AI, and America would balance that energy demand. And as Anush says, I always pack two questions. And how will that play out with the water? Because water and data centers are, Siamese twins in the region, in your opinion.
These are actually not two questions. These are multiple questions that are masquerading as two.
I told you to watch out for him.
Let me gather my thoughts for a second. So there's actually let's kind of organize it into three questions, right? I mean, the first really relates to how do we interpret what the Gulf is doing vis-a-vis the United States, right? In terms of the numbers, in terms of other things. And then we're having a discussion on AI, and then kind of a subsidiary question on the environment. So in terms of what the Gulf is doing, I mean, they're Trump whisperers, right? They know Trump, I think, well, in terms of what he's looking for and what he is searching in terms of optics. And I think they've really satisfied that quite well. And I think if you look at capital flows, right, of kind of the petrodollar recycling dynamic, I think that has held true to a large extent for the past few decades, not just in terms of armaments, but just in terms of the investment in treasury bonds, but also more importantly now increasingly the sovereign wealth fund investments and portfolios in the United States. I mean, every time now US officials come, even Trump now in his recent trip, the Emiratis make it very clear that they have invested cumulatively something to the tune of $1 trillion in the US economy. The Saudis also have huge portfolios, the Qataris, etc. I mean, sovereign wealth fund assets and holdings, if you look at the breakdown of where they're actually parking their money and where they're putting it in. I mean, let's put aside kind of the domestic recycling, because, for instance, the PIF has a mandate domestically. The overseas investments, 85% of it is going to OECD markets and primarily the United States, right? So this shows kind of the very deep financial linkages that are far more substantive and for the most part are largely absent in the case of Gulf-China relations, which again, kind of tells you about the way in which maybe the deep recesses of power are more tied to finance and tech than they are, say, to the superficial trade volumes that people tend to focus on when they talk about China's economic footprint in the region. So I think they are kind of harnessing the optics surrounding their financial power to message certain things to the US. Now, in terms of the numbers that have been put forward in Riyadh and Doha and Abu Dhabi to the tune of hundreds of billions, I don't think they're realistic. And even if you look at the first Trump administration's visit, similar numbers were bandied. They were slightly more humble. So I think maybe they're taking inflation into account. But they don't materialize. These are like IOU type of situations, or even similar to MOUs that are signed. They're aspirational, but they don't necessarily translate into anything. although I do think money will be transferred, but in specific categories and things that are of strategic interest to these actors, right? The NVIDIA chips are one good example, and so forth. Now, in terms of AI, I think there are two stories happening, right, in terms of the AI space in the Gulf. And again, I'm not a kind of an expert in this arena, but I'm just, sharing my thoughts as someone who observes it. I think there's very big interest to harness AI technologies to propel kind of the techno-industrial transformation across the Gulf, right? And this is also potentially tied with the bid of the various Gulf states to develop Arabic AI, right? So there's Fanar in Qatar, for example. I think Jusair in the United Arab Emirates. There are also similar projects in Saudi and initiatives. The most recent one is Humane, that had been announced during Trump's visit. And I think all of these states are trying to position themselves as actors who are capable of capturing economic dividends both domestically and regionally, right? This is kind of interesting, I think, as it speaks to really how much the Gulf has changed over the past 10 years, because you can see as a result of the different vision policies and the different kind of emphases on industrialization, there's growing interest in the regional markets, which did not exist before. I mean, if you look at like intra-Arab trade statistics, they've always been quite low. But this is actually changing as a lot of these states are beginning to target the immediate surroundings. So this is one element in the AI story. And obtaining chips and other things is very integral for it. The other thing, which I think is more tied to your question, is that the Gulf seems to want to position itself in the global value chain of AI, right? Especially with regards to data processing. And I think here they're trying to capitalize on just the fact that energy is very cheap, right? I don't know to what extent they've made progress in that area. It would be interesting to delve into the numbers and think more deeply about it, into the nitty-gritty of it. I know that this is an idea that has been brought up. Like, for example, there's this very perceptive analyst, Abdullah Zabin, I think is his name, who wrote a great piece on petrocomputing, which was essentially making this argument, right? Kind of the utilization of the Gulf's energy advantages in order to position itself, not necessarily at the very top or the low end of the value chain, but in a middling position where it uses its energy for those purposes, right? And it's also a very interesting kind of development if it happens. I was talking to a colleague who was a political economist last week, and we were discussing kind of the revisions that had happened with regards to, I think it was the International Energy Agency's calculations about the trajectory for oil demand. And they were saying how 2-3 years ago, the report that was issued about global oil demand was expected to peak by 2030 and then stagnate for the following decade and then begin to decline. But they were saying that the most recent report showed, in fact, that they had to recalculate things. And they believe that we may have already passed peak oil, and that in fact we've entered the stagnation period and a potential decline in it, which is really interesting because you would expect, given the growing investment in AI, that this would spike energy demands as well as water demands. But in terms of energy, the report also discussed, based on her claim, that because of applications of AI, there has been so many energy saving gains that it has offset whatever demands on energy are created by AI, right? So one potential trajectory that one could expect seeing is the Gulf kind of dealing with the decline of global demand on energy to really redirect its oil-based political economy to serve data centers for AI.
Right. I mean, you're right. You're opening pages of a very unknown world. Even the people who are in this business, Mohammed, are not quite sure where it's going. And it's that this dialectics of energy, which is now playing out in a way that we never expected in the 20th century or the first quarter of this century. But the essence of what you say, one comment first is that, but we know that Iran's attempts to generate Bitcoin nearly bankrupted their energy sector to such an extent that even now an oil-rich, gas-rich country suffers from electricity cuts because they simply lost the capacity to service communal needs at the altar of becoming a Bitcoin giant. So you got to be careful what you wish for when it comes to this stuff. But I would draw a distinction between AI and Bitcoin, partly because the metrics of energy use seem to be different. Nevertheless, in this brave new world, from your analysis and looking at that oil market in particular, let's leave gas aside, low price oil seems to be in everybody's interest, right? China loves it, obviously, for very good reasons. The American two sisters that remain out of the seven sisters obviously do not like it because it limits the ability to frack. Fine. Canada is also suffering. But in the GCC in particular, given that they have kind of, if you like, mitigated against lower prices by diversifying, as you rightly said, and also finding cheaper alternatives for many of the products that used to import from the West, from China and elsewhere, that the high oil price serves a budgetary function rather than a bigger macroeconomic function. Given all that, and given that thanks to China's massive investments in renewables, peak oil may have reached before the 2030s, right? I think China are the real heroes of this transition. Given all that, peak oil has all sorts of other political implications, Mohammed, right? For the global economy, because we're still so dependent on hydrocarbons, crude oil and natural gas. Talking of peak oil has its own dangers to investors. So how do you think notions of now beginning to talk about peak oil affect this grand intercontinental exchanges that puts the GCC right at the heart of these mobilities?
It's a very difficult question to answer because I think it's really kind of the post-oil cataclysm, let's say, or the possibility of getting to a post-oil cataclysm that has driven the Gulf's, restructuring and reforms for the past 15, 20 years. And I think they're kind of caught in a very difficult situation, particularly in this decade, where they want to make these post-oil transitions, but that requires quite a high break-even price for oil, right? Just for, as you mentioned, for kind of budgetary purposes. But I think in that sense, they're really trying to rethink their position in the global economy in new dramatic ways, right? So this is kind of where trying to fit yourself in an AI value chain, trying to actually also convince the semiconductor industry to link you up with their own value chain. All of this is part of that process of repositioning the Gulf and maintaining its relevance, right? And certainly, I mean, one could argue that at least for the past 25 years, the Gulf has been able to successfully, to some extent, become a hyperconnector to different regions. I mean, if you think of, say, the air hubs that have successfully developed in Doha, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai, and maybe potentially soon in Riyadh, I mean, these are not to be dismissed, right? These are quite lucrative and very successful projects that channel tens of millions of people, right? But I think that the problem now for the Gulf, right, is that the Gulf moment, in some ways, if we choose to use Abdullah Abdul Khaliq's term, is one that now is beginning to see limits to its horizons, right? I mean, there's very real structural problems that are beginning to appear, I think, in the horizon. There's going to be a need for tightening of belts. And I think there will also be a need to kind of rethink how do we pool the resources of the GCC together? Because at this stage, everyone is ultimately trying to cast their own nation as the central hub in this story of mobile exchanges of peoples and goods, right? Everyone is building the key port that will transfer trade, that will funnel people, that will funnel ideas. But ultimately, if everyone does that, no one really gains much, right? The dividends become much less. So my own kind of aspirational hope, and I think that there is potentially a pathway for it, given how much the Gulf foreign policy has evolved and has matured, right? Especially back from 2014 onwards, when you compare the current moment with that period, or even during the height of the diplomatic rift from 2017 to 2021, is that I think they will increasingly recognize that it would become necessary for the GCC to pool its resources together and work off of each other's strengths, because the Gulf together can have a huge multiplier effect. I mean, the best example for that is probably Syria, right? I mean, who would have thought that these states that a few years ago had such dramatically different ideological positions and backed different horses and parties across the region would come together on Syria, and with so much good actually coming out of it, right? Facilitating the Syrian government's international recognition, facilitating the lifting of the sanctions regime, providing aid even prior to the lifting of sanctions. And all of that really shows the potential of the Gulf to really amplify its strength if it comes together and really think through how do they position themselves in a new world order that requires them to operate as a bloc and requires them perhaps to think about infrastructural integration where each state is a hub for something specific, right? I mean, I'm not saying that they need to end competition. Competition is healthy, but I think certainly there is a need now for the Gulf to really think as a collective in order to be able to manage the challenges that are going to mount in the next few decades, right? Because none of these states, I think, will have the wherewithal or the capacity to deal with the climate problems, the security problems, and the vast economic changes. Because, technology, I think, is going to dramatically reshape our societies in the next 10, 20 years. I mean, if you think of, say, roboticization, for example, right? The Gulf states, I mean, most people are not aware of this, are trying to also position themselves as producers of robots, right? Especially in Saudi Arabia under the Alat company. And I think their long-term thinking, and it actually makes sense, is that the Gulf has a competitive advantage when it comes to capital. This is a capital-intensive type of industry. And if you want to industrialize, you can't draw on cheap labor. So the best or the second best outcome is to use your capital to create productive capacity through dark factories or fully automated industries. But there are very serious social implications for such a thing, because then, you create a context that could be potentially one defined by mass unemployment, especially if robotization goes beyond the manufacturing sector. And this will have very serious implications for stability, for a lot of different things. So there is a need for the GCC to really come together looking ahead. Sorry, I'm just sharing a lot of thoughts.
No, it's great as always. I personally hope that we can close our eyes, wake up, and the region is prosperous and happy and tickety-boo. I'm a bit skeptical about some of these vectors and, the removal of sanctions and everything. One of my friends was saying Iraq still has to get approvals on how it spends its oil money from Washington after all these years and which type of turbine it has to buy, whether it would be GE or, Siemens. So I think the jury is out. But one point as well, because you say dialogue, China this year will arrive to 50% of its energy needs domestically as renewables. So I think in that front, they are way ahead. But I wanted to ask you a question, because this is an area that you're expert and you've done so much of studies. China's expectation for mediation in regional crisis, China's appetite for machination as well in global scene, and commitment for reconstruction. Are these three vectors anytime soon coming together because it's the second largest power in the world, and economically at least? So does China have the wherewithal to stand up? You've talked about the détente between Saudi and Iran and that how China sees the moment on that so eloquently. Does it have the appetite for machinations in really getting involved in a, post-Trump Europe world, and the commitment for reconstruction, because it has all the goods and capacities? So will it come to redevelop Syria, or that's the turf between now GCC on one side, Turkey on one side, and America, which is now holding the oil fields and silicon fields in Syria? What's in it for China?
I mean, there are a couple of issues here. I think for example, when it comes to, say, mediation or reconstruction, right, there are certain parameters that really kind of shapes Chinese approaches to it as a state, as private actors constituted by companies or state-owned enterprises or what have you. In terms of reconstruction, for example, I think it's really the search for profit. They will go there if there are contracts that make their presence viable. Or if, for example, the state deems that there is a political interest to participate in some degree of reconstruction, right? This was certainly the case with the entry of, say, Chinese companies to Saudi Arabia back in 2006, when they took on the rail project at a loss, right? But I think overall, what's going to really shape that is the search for profit, very much as it did during the Assad period. It was just simply not viable for them to go to make money. Now, maybe under these different circumstances, that will change the dynamic. In terms of mediation and kind of more macro approaches to the region on the part of the Chinese state, I think they will, continue to maintain a very pragmatic approach where they will engage with all actors in the region, but not necessarily invest significant political capital or risk getting entangled in the region's political and security issues. I mean, look at the past 2 years, right, with the crisis in Gaza. The Chinese are absent. Right. I mean, they do issue things in the UN, etc., but they're not part of the regional debates or the global debates when it comes to Gaza, right? And there's a reason for that, because it's just simply not a major priority for them, or one that actually risks their core interests of engagement in the region. And I don't think that'll change. And I don't actually hold it, Yani, as something that is that one should look to China and askance and expect them to change, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're sitting in Zhongnanhai in Beijing and you're looking at the global arena, there are certain strategic theaters of interest to you, and the Middle East is simply not one of them, right? I mean, despite what is said in the region, despite what is said in Washington, right? I like Andrea Giselli's phrase, as he puts it, the region is the most important among the unimportant regions to China. And I think that's actually absolutely correct, right? They draw, I mean, yes, they draw energy resources from it. They have extensive economic footprints there. They have a diaspora that's growing, but this does not necessarily translate into something that is at the heart of Chinese, say, national interest and power, right? And I think it's also part of an analytical mistake on the part of people who always think about the great powers as pursuing the same things, right? Each great power is shaped by its geography, by its history, and the baggage of its interactions with the world. So the expression of US power globally in its relation to the Middle East. Sorry, Ali, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I know Anush is bursting with that question, but then I remember you telling us a few minutes ago how GCC have played so smartly China and US against one another. So if that is not of that significance, how do they play that card with United States?
The reason is that this is a perception in the United States.
How interesting. Okay.
The United States, right, views China, as we would say in Arabic, as a berber, right? It's a monster that is always there, and it really shapes their approaches to the region. I mean, the US government opened up kind of arms in the State Department to follow and track Chinese influence all around the world, right? And so the US has a China-US frame of mind and rivalry that doesn't necessarily exist, say, in the Chinese context. Not that they don't see that there is a rivalry, but they don't necessarily interpret their presence in the region or other regions, for example, aside from the Middle East, as one that operates within that prism, right? That's the key issue, I think. And I think the Middle Eastern actors are also very much aware. I think this is also the problem. Like, people tend to forget that there are debates at the local level, and there are also debates in Beijing. But oftentimes the focus is in the US, their debates, and then they project it onto the rest of the world and assume everyone has signed up to that, right? But this is kind of the key here. But just kind of to finish my point, the expression of US power is very different from the expression of British power a century ago, right? The tools, the instruments, the areas of priority. And China is going to be inevitably different if it becomes kind of a hegemon akin to the United States. I mean, for all intents and purposes, maybe in 50 years, the main areas of strategic interest will be the moon and the inner part of our solar system, right? With helium-3 and others. And Earth and its different geographies will be considered to be, to borrow from Trump, shitholes of strategic interest, right? Or disinterest. All I'm just saying is that the frames will be different, inevitably different.
Yeah, but Mohammed, actually, I look forward to that world where borders become irrelevant on this planet, and pursuit of riches takes us outside of our clubbered earth. But I mean, that's a wonderful analogy that you've put in front of us. I'm just amongst the millions of questions that I would want to ask, but I know we don't have time. So just one for you. Again, I'm very interested in how China is processing America under Trump. They had their concerns about Biden because Biden seemed to have a very different strategy, and his IRA, for example, had a kind of a geoeconomic purpose. Trump, for me, has no purpose. He's just a vandal in the China shop, and it may or may not work. And his transactionalism is actually at times working to their advantage, but more often than not, working against America's, if you like, deeper, longer-term interests. But for China, who, apart from European Union, is the only country that has to manage these crises that the White House seems to generate at the global level, not just bilaterally. Do they look at Trump as an opportunity for the next 4 years? Or opportunity in terms of, if this guy's a peacemaker, we are the reconstructors, that in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, in Ukraine, let them make peace and then we'll reconstruct. We'll do the business on the ground, right? So this kind of pedestrian, if you like, transaction. But if you put that aside, at the bigger macro level, do they see this as a real threat to China's national interests, which are now, have got all these nodes internationally? Or do they see Trump's weakening of American structures of power as something that we will have to manage? If you like, the Americans don't recognize the decline. It's the Chinese that have to manage America's decline in a peaceful way to avoid an unwanted confrontation with China. Sorry, it's a long-winded question, but I think you get the gist of it.
Well, it's an excellent question. And I think, it's probably the latter, which is that they have to hold and maintain kind of the internal domestic policies as it relates to developing key kind of strategic industries and kind of positioning China at the technological forefront. And they're certainly making advances in quite a wide array of technologies, right? Where 15 years ago, if you said that the Chinese would make progress when it comes to semiconductors or robotics, you'd be laughed out of the room. But the innovation is quite real and the advances are quite real. And I think, this kind of ties back to what I said a bit earlier in our discussion, which is they recognized that there has been a set course and kind of a consensus, in fact, that has emerged in US politics, Democrat, Republican, that China is a rival to the United States. I mean, you see it at all levels, even in their own defense papers, the Beltway research pieces, et cetera, that have been coming out for the past decade. And you could argue that that has been the area where there has been a very high degree of consistency in the Trump, Biden, and now second Trump administrations, right? I mean, it's interesting. Biden did not dismantle a lot of the China-related policies, right? I mean, he maintained them. And in fact, even with regards to the Middle East, it's so interesting how much of a shift Trump has augured and has been maintained by US elites who had inherited him, even though they've kind of attacked him constantly. But I think their reading, and from what I see from like discussions and from Chinese outlets, is that the US is facing a lot of structural problems that Trump is trying to resolve, right? There is a possibility that he will aggravate it. But you do also see analysts who are very cognizant that Trump could very well be one who can rejuvenate the United States, right? And reshape it in new ways, right? I mean, they see that in terms of the macro numbers, in terms of US positionality, it has been dramatically hurt by Trump, but you don't know where the US will be in a year, 2 or 3 years, right? I mean, I don't know. It's really interesting because also the problem with the Trump administration is that there's just so much ideological conflict within about the direction that the US needs to take. I mean, it's very obvious there's a consensus that the current status quo is unsustainable. And you see different proposals like the Mar-a-Lago re-empowerment of the dollar agreement. You see the whole talk about West Hemispherism and industrial re-entrenchment. So there's kind of this hodgepodge of different ideas that all point to statism coming back in vogue in the United States. Industrial policy has lost the sensitivities around it, right? And that was something also certainly very patent under the Biden administration with the CHIP Act, which I don't understand the Trump administration's calculations of lifting. But all of this, suffice to say, is that you do see actors and observers in China who see that the US still has a capacity to renew itself. Surprisingly reminding me of something you said, Anush, many, many years ago about the United States along similar lines.
Well, I guess
I stand by that, by the way, Mohammed. I think it does.
Yeah.
I guess 3 years is a good time to ask for a refreshment on your advice to cinephobes and cinephiles. Has that advice changed or it's the same?
Remind me, what was the advice? I say a lot of things that I forget.
I have to tell you that we are in a very interesting time, all of us, and I always feel people and scholars and thought leaders like yourself are the lighthouses in these choppy waters. So which direction of advice you would point to the cinephobes and cinephiles today, Mohammed, given everything you shared with us today?
Yeah. I'm struggling to remember what it
I'm
was
not going to
exactly
tell
I
you
said
what you
in
said, Mohammed. Come on. That means you have to come back to our program sooner than 3 years.
Probably, yeah. But I think, yeah, well, if it's about xenophobes and xenophiles, it's probably really about kind of the mind images that they have about these actors, whether it's China or the United States. I mean, there's the world that we live in is extremely complex. And these are obviously complex states and societies and governments. And certainly, even like when we say China or the United States does this or that, that's just a simplification for the purpose of the conversation. But things are, I mean, it's very difficult to predict where things are going, especially in a world where there are just too many unknowns, right? This is all I have to say. This is the only safeguard I can offer for myself.
I would think that you know, you would have been a gifted lawyer as well, not just an academic.
Let's not call it a cop out, Dr. Sudairi. Let's not call it a cop out.
It's a cop out. It's a cop out.
I'll tell you what, though. For sure, we're not going to wait 3 years to have you back on our program, Mohammed, because we learn from you by the second as you articulate such wonderfully precise, clear analysis about the world, as you rightly say, is complex and unpredictable and not a binary. And the depth of structure, agency, interactions, dynamics are greater than we can ever imagine. So I suspect you will expect a Nicole within 3 years, not by 3 years, to be back here.
I like that.
You may escape to Australia, but the BRI Dialogues has very long reach, Dr. Sudairi, and it will find you. And because I think our world benefits from hearing from Mohammed. So we are really grateful to you for sharing your thoughts with us so freely and kindly and with such extraordinary insights that you provide as always. So thank you very much indeed, Mohammed.
Thank you very much.
My ego is now this size, this big.
Shukran jazilan, Mohammed. Thank you.
Shukran. Khuda hafiz.
Outstanding.